All right, episode 5, wind. There's a particular quality shared by the very best delivery leaders and the strongest teams, and it's very difficult to describe sometimes without sounding too mystical. It's the ability to sense what's happening long before it becomes visible. It's the way that they adapt to problems without these problems being fully formed. It's the way they read a room, the way they notice hesitation, silence, a change in someone's posture maybe, and understand that it signals something meaningful. This isn't sort of a romantic version of instinct. It's awareness shaped by experience, a disciplined perception that grows only when someone has spent enough time paying attention to what others are overlooking. That's wind. So if fire is the force that propels you forward, the wind is that subtle intelligence that stops you from walking into a brick wall. Now, every team will broadcast information constantly, but most of it is silent. You don't hear it in the words, but in the spaces in between, you see it in how someone glances away when a topic arises, or how an update that sounds routine on the surface carries a note of discomfort underneath it. You notice it when someone begins to speak less in a stand-up. And that's not because their workload has reduced, but maybe their confidence has. Most metrics will not show you this. Julia certainly can't. But wind is the practice of noticing them anyway. It's the discipline of reading the emotional weather before a storm. People often imagine that risks emerge suddenly, as if overnight the team goes from smooth sailing to sinking. But as in most situations in life, both outside of work but also inside of work, failure begins as a tiny shift, as an early signal that carries no urgency until someone with wind recognizes what it means. I've seen teams where everything on paper looked great. Their throughput was steady, the sprint reports were clean, their roadmap was very clear, and nobody had raised any alarms. But the moment I sat in a refinement session, I felt something under the surface. A slight tightness in the conversation, a reluctance to question assumptions, a subtle way in which people defer to one another rather than express what they actually thought. Nothing was said outright, but that feeling was unmistakable. The team had lost its psychological elasticity. They were functioning, but they'd stopped challenging one another. The collaboration had become just very polite, overly curated, very almost scripted. And whenever a team behaves like this internally, it's usually because of something unresolved, a missed expectation, a unspoken conflict, a fear that honest disagreement will create more problems than it can resolve. If I'd looked at the metrics, I would have assumed that this was an amazingly thriving team. But the metrics were describing the past. The wind to me was revealing the present. And once we were able to name the tension, once that silence was allowed to be spoken, the team breathed a sigh of relief. They didn't need a process change, they'd need awareness. And that's the power of wind. It turns invisible problems into visible choices. Now, when leaders lack wind, they often confuse confidence with clarity. They make decisions with great intensity, but with no understanding. They rush into action because that lack of awareness gives them a false sense of security. And this looks really decisive on the surface, but it creates downstream chaos, decisions that often have to be reversed, commitments that just collapse under scrutiny, and timelines that are based on a sort of hope rather than reality. Probably the most dangerous consequence of missing wind is the erosion of teams. Teams will quickly realize when their leaders can't perceive the emotional current. If someone is burning out and the leader doesn't notice, the message is clear: your suffering is invisible. If someone withdraws and becomes quieter, less engaged, and nobody notices, that silence hardens into resignation. Wind protects that humanity of the team, and without it, even the most well-structured project can just become emotionally barren, which is horrendous for delivery. And wind isn't just about emotions, it's systemic. It's the ability to see patterns before they form in data. For example, stories start to take longer to complete, not dramatically, but subtly. This is maybe the first sign of architectural trouble or hidden dependencies. The stakeholder missing a few ceremonies, that's the start of misalignment. The same kind of defect in releases appearing multiple times, that's the beginning of technical debt as a behavior, not as an event. So leaders with strong wind don't treat these signals as isolated facts. They see them as indicators of system thinking, broader system thinking. They understand that delivery never breaks suddenly. It bends quietly, then bends a little bit more. And then later, when the bending has just become too much to ignore, everyone notices it. Oh, that's bent. That's off. By then, the effort to repair it is far greater. So wind allows you to make those adjustments, make them earlier, make them less painfully. And when you develop wind, leadership begins to feel like less of a series of firefights and more like a process of continuous quiet steering. You spend less time reacting and more time anticipating. You stop being surprised by problems because you recognize the shape of those problems before they fully emerge. You become that person in the room who can sense the truth below the surface. And the team really responds to that. They trust leaders who notice. They trust leaders who listen to what was being said. They trust leaders who perceive the emotional and operational terrain long enough and with enough clarity to guide them without flinching. But as with the other rings, wind alone is not enough. Awareness gives you insight, but insight must still eventually deepen into a space where you're able to step back from the noise, sift through the patterns, and ask the questions that open up pathways to entirely new possibilities. Awareness without that stillness becomes overwhelming because noticing everything is not the same as understanding what it means. And that's why the next ring, void, is so powerful. Void is where that energy finally drops, where thinking turns spacious, where strategy emerges not from pressure, but from clarity. So, if earth is the ground and water is the movement, fire is the decisions, and wind is the perception, then void is the quiet that gives all of these any kind of meaning. In the next episode, that's what we're going to explore. Void, the place where innovation begins, where unnecessary work dissolves, and where leaders can hold uncertainty not as a threat, but as a source of insight. Thanks for listening. Hit like, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in episode 6.